Okay, so now that you have your tank full of water, it's on a stand or on a really sturdy countertop, now you're ready to kind of start putting the pieces together. And we always start with a filter. Really important that you do not plug your filter in yet. You want to wait until the end. I will tell you when to plug it in, but you need to have everything all set up first. And then we're going to have to prime the pump. But before we can do that, so these were the little baskets that sit inside your canister. So this is the filter canister, and you want to get them set up with your filter media. So on the bottom basket, I'm going to put one piece of black foam. And you should see, again, I have kind of an old piece of black foam that I'm using for training purposes, so it's a little crumbly, but so you want that to go on the bottom. Then in your middle basket, so you just set that right on top, and you want to make sure it sits cleanly, so it's not kind of like, you know, off to the side or tilted one way or another, so you want it to sit pretty cleanly. But in that one, you're going to put your charcoal rocks. So you just put that right in the bottom, and then you're going to top that with a piece of white foam, just like that. And then in your top filter piece, you're going to put 2 pieces of white foam. Yours has a handle. Again, not all models have these little handles in there. It makes it nice to get them out. You're going to push that down. Again, set it cleanly on top as best you can. And then you're going to top it with this little grate with these kind of grooves facing outward, just like that. All right, and then once I'm gonna double check that everything's sitting nicely, and then I'm gonna place this in there. Some models have baskets that clasp together, so you can just pick the whole thing up and put it in. But if you have to put them in individually, again, just double check that things are sitting pretty cleanly together. And you'll be able to tell if they can't, so then you put the grate back on top there. And then you want to make sure that you align the downspout. So it's the one that just kind of pokes up a little bit more than this one, and it's got this kind of more narrow piece right here with this port, this hole right there in your filter. So you're going to gently place the lid on top, and it should sit pretty flush. And then you're going to see if you can close these. Now see, I'm already feeling some resistance. These things should close super, super easily. If you're feeling any resistance, don't force it because these things break. That means that something is not lining up correctly. So I've got to see here. Looks like I've got a little bit of a gap in this filter right here. So okay, so we readjusted stuff, and then the lid should sit pretty cleanly on top, so there's not a big gap here on either side. And then again, just gently press down. There wasn't a lot of resistance there. Then you should be able to do these ones the same, and there you go. So lid is on securely, and then we will start connecting the tubes. All right. So now we're going to kind of start connecting the tubing. Before you do that, you want to make sure that you have your filter and your chiller kind of set in good spots. I like to set them up on sort of opposite sides of the tank. Ideally, you want your chiller to have the back, which is all the way back here, facing away from the tank and a good amount of distance for the wall. For our purposes for training, ours is a little close just because we're in our cramped office space, but ideally I would have this filter maybe facing with the back this way, so it's blowing out and away, because otherwise it can be harder. The chiller has to work harder to cool things down. So right now I just have it kind of sitting there, and oops, let me get it a little more stable. There we go. And then we've got the filter over here. For setup, if you have yours up on a counter, it can be easier just for setup purposes to have your filter a little bit lower. So I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Okay, so now we're ready to start connecting the tubing. And we usually start with connecting the tubing to the filter. So the filter pieces are these 2 tubings right here with these that will twist on, and then these valves that open and close. They are both in the closed position right now. So it's kind of going like across the tubing. Going with the tubing vertically is when they're open. I like to leave them closed while we're getting things set up. So most of your filters should have this as well. So it says in, it's engraved there, and out. It can be hard to see. And then most of them are also color coded. So you'll notice that the blue matches the blue. So blue should be in on your filter, which means that water, that water comes from the tank and goes into your filter. So into the filter there. So to connect it, and I'm gonna flip this around just so it's a little easier for me. You just set it there and then you twist until that is tight. There we go. So that's nice and tight. And then we're going to do the same with this one. So this one is the out port on your filter there. So it still has a blue arrow there, but notice it doesn't have the blue ring on it. So this one connects to the out, and that means that water is going to come out of the filter and then it'll connect to the chiller, which we'll get to in just a moment. So same thing, you just line it up and then twist it on until it's nice and tight. Okay, so now those are all connected there. And then on the other end of the in port to your filter, so the blue one, there's gonna be this plastic tubing, and that actually connects to the intake basket. So again, this is how water gets into the chiller. So it goes from the tank into here, and this just slides on there really easy. You can make it longer or shorter. I usually have it about like medium length. I don't like it to touch the bottom of the tank, just in case little fish get stuck in there, or Elvin, as they're still kind of learning how to survive. But this just goes right over. I like to keep it on kind of one of the far corners of the tank there. It's okay if it doesn't sit super nice and pretty, just as long as it's in there. It's really important, once your filter is up and running, you do not want to remove the intake basket or expose it to air. So if you lift it up like this while you're cleaning, an air bubble can get in there, and then you have to re-prime the pump, which is something we're gonna have to do to get it going, and that can be a pain. So really try to leave that in there. So that is the filter, and then we're gonna connect this part. So again, water goes into the filter, gets cleaned, and then the clean water is gonna go out of the filter and into our chiller. All right, sometimes you have to move things a little bit just depending on the size of your tubing. For new tanks, we usually cut the tubing for kind of how it's gonna fit. And so similar to your filter, your chiller does have in black kind of engraved letters in and out. So the water coming from the filter into the chiller is going to connect here. So this again, you just twist on because the clean water goes into the chiller, and you just want to twist until that is nice and tight. Okay. And then we've got an out port on your chiller. And so the water is going to come, the chilled water comes out of the chiller, and then it actually goes back into your tank through your spray bar. So I'm going to connect this here, same thing. So connecting to the out port and just twisting until that's nice and tight. It's okay if these don't go all the way down, just making sure that they're level and it feels tight. And then this section with this plastic tubing here, I'm gonna run around the back of this tank. It doesn't really matter what way you run it, as long as it just fits nicely in your setup. And then this hangs over and will connect to the spray bar, which again has all these little holes in it. So, and this just slides really nicely like that. And then I like to keep the spray bar out of the water. Make sure these holes are facing somewhat down. You want them to kind of spray across the water here. Again, that's gonna give your fish lots of oxygen, but just make sure they're not spraying up so you don't end up with water all over your classroom. All right, so then that is set up there. And then you want to kind of double check your tubing. Again, we have a little bit of a funky setup here because we're in our cramped office, but normally you really want to make sure that there's no big coils or corkscrews. This is about as curvy as I would want this tube to get, and maybe even a little curvier than I'd like it to be. But again, we're just in sort of a funky setup in our office here. But make sure that there are no big kinks in there that can make it hard for the water to get through. And then you might also want to double check on all the tubing connecting points. So some of them have these little plastic things. You just want to make sure those are tight on there. See, this one's a little bit loose, so I'm just going to turn it a little bit. just until you feel a little bit of resistance there. And that is just gonna make sure, so this is kind of sealing the tube there so water doesn't drip out here. You might also have these metal connection points, which these need a screwdriver to tighten, but these usually stay nice and tight for a long time. So on the chiller, those are the two that I have there, but those both feel really nice and tight around the kind of soft tubing. And then same thing for the points that connect to going into the tank. This one is nice and tight, so that should be sealed there. And this one here. All right, so now that all the tubing is connected, you kind of figured out where you want your filter and your chiller to live. Now we're gonna prime the pump. And I think it's good when you connect the tubes to have your filter kind of where it's gonna sit, just so you know that the tubes will reach. But to prime the pump, I like to put it somewhere that it's accessible. Now, if possible, having your filter lower than your chiller can be helpful for priming the pump, because what we're doing by priming it is we're trying to get the air bubbles out so that it can run on its own. So when you have it lower, the air bubbles rise and it gets a little bit easier. Again, in our office, it's a little bit funky, so they're pretty level here. So that just means I might have to work a little bit harder to get that through. So to prime the pump, first, we're gonna turn these valves open. So again, they're closed when they're kind of going horizontal, and then when they go kind of vertical with the tubing, they're open. So both the in and the out port are open. And then this button here is how you prime the pump. And you're just gonna kind of pump it over and over, sort of like you're doing CPR. And again, sometimes this goes really quick. Sometimes it can take a little bit of time, but you can already hear, or maybe not in the video, but water coming through here. And basically we're gonna have to fill this whole thing up. It looks, and sometimes it does it on its own. See, it's already kind of going there. So I'm just gonna keep helping it a little bit. See if that keeps going. These black things in there, that's just some algae from last year. That's okay, that should get filtered out in the next week or so. And that's also why we like to set up our tanks in advance of getting our fish at least a couple weeks. Okay, so that's pretty full there. So sometimes you can try and plug it in once it's all the way full, and it might just kick off on its own. And so you just give it a sec. So water's gonna be coming out. Oh, and coming through the spray bar. So usually once this fills all the way, you can let it go. If you were still having issues, you would just keep priming the pump until you made water manually come out of the spray bar here. And it should be coming through pretty freely as you're pumping. But usually if this fills, and you don't have any air bubbles stuck, then you should be pretty good just to plug it in. So now that the filter is plugged in, I'm going to gently put it where I want it to live for the year. If you jostle it, you can add another air bubble in there. So there we go. Just gonna give it a help there. There we go. So if you notice the spray bar slowed down a little bit, so I just pumped the prime a few times just to make sure it was still going. And now that water is freely coming through, now we can turn on the chiller. So some chillers, the newer ones, have an on-off switch. This is an older model, so it doesn't. So I always just recommend don't plug your chiller in until you're ready to turn it on. So I'm gonna turn it on. And again, every chiller is a little bit different. So you're gonna hit set. And this shows the temperature that it's set to. I like to have it set somewhere between 47 and 51. That's kind of the sweet spot for salmon. So 47 is great. The number that it's displaying, now that it's not blinking, that is the temperature that it is. So that's gonna show you what temperature is inside your tank. The chiller can take a couple of hours to chill all of the water there. So just keep an eye on it, and within, 5 hours, if this doesn't drop at all, or by the next day, if it's not down to within 3 degrees of your set temperature, then you want to double check that things are working. And there's a troubleshooting section in your Salmon Tank Manual, or you can give me a call as well. But so that's pretty much it. So you will leave this up to run. Again, all this algae in the tank should get filtered out. That's just from last year. A lot of it gets kind of stuck in the tubes. It can be pretty hard to flush out. So you just let it filter out. You can also scoop some out with the aquarium net. All right, the last thing that you want to do before you get your fish and as you set up your tank is to set up the aerator. So you can kind of set this wherever. Sometimes you set it on top of the chiller, or if you have a countertop, or depending on how long your tubes are, you can set it off to the side or even down below. Again, it just depends on how long these tubes are. So again, I'm just gonna make sure that the tubes are on here nice and good. There's no gaps there. And then I have my tubes running back around the back of the tank. And that's just so they don't obstruct the view for students to view your salmon. And then I'm gonna place them in the tank. So I kind of like to set them a little bit apart. And it's really important to not set one super close to your intake basket, because that basket can suck up air and then you would get an air bubble in there. So I like to set it maybe kind of over here or so. It doesn't matter too much. We're just trying to make sure that there's different pockets of oxygen in here. So you're getting some oxygen from the spray bar, and then you're gonna get some from these two stones. So once you have them set where you would like them, then you're just going to plug this in. Now, again, there's different models of aerators. So some might have an on-off switch. Some you can even have, there's a dial to show how much oxygen you would like. I always like lots of oxygen for salmon. It's very important for them. So I like to have that dial up nice and high. But this one is just a model where you just plug it in and then it goes. Sometimes the air stones need to soak for a little bit. So these ones are already working pretty good, but sometimes if they've soaked in the water for 15 minutes or so, they'll start releasing more bubbles there. And we can always buy more stones, which just connect to the tubing if needed. Okay, so the last step before you get your eggs delivered is to add beneficial or starter bacteria to your tank. Beneficial bacteria is super important. It basically keeps the water quality healthy. The bacteria will break down things like fish waste and stuff like that. So super important. Now, depending on what kind you have, it's going to be a little bit different on how you set it up. The one that I recommend using is Tetra Safe Start Plus, and it looks like this. And you are going to add, on the day that you get your eggs, you're going to add the whole entire bottle. And make sure that you have a bottle that is up to at least 50 gallons per your tank. Again, it'll have the instructions on the back there, but you're gonna add the whole bottle in there. You can't add too much. It's all gonna be in there. And if you add it too early, then the bacteria will die before it has anything to feed off of. So as the eggs are in there and they're respirating, that will create just enough waste to keep the bacteria alive. If you use a different kind of starter bacteria, you may need to add additional doses of your bacteria up for the first like 2 weeks that you have your eggs, just to make sure that the bacteria colony survives. But other than that, you should be all set to go to get your fish.